Hello and welcome to Contemplations. I'm joined by John.
Hello.
And I'm Josh. So what we're going to be talking about today is American cultural influence in Britain. And there's a number of different reasons why this might be interesting. Because of course, we quite often talk about how British culture, particularly sort of classical liberalism, shaped the politics of, say, the Founding Fathers, but we don't actually often discuss how America influences us. And one of the ways in which it influences us is through American culture. There are lots of different ways that happens, and we're going to talk about why America is particularly significant in influencing British culture, what causes this influence in the first place, and what are the results. And we're going to try and pinpoint what aspects of American culture are particularly good at disseminating in Britain, which ones are not.
And I think it would be good to assess what influences have been good and which have been bad as well.
Yeah. I think that it's just in a purely academic sense, it's interesting to see how these cultural artifacts propagate, how culture spreads, because of course, if we are going to fight a culture war, it's nice to know a bit about how culture actually works in a society.
That's a very good point.
And of course, it's also interesting to compare the differences and the similarities, considering that Britain was the sort of dominant parent culture in the founding of the United States. So the influence back upon Britain is interesting because it's almost like you have two different islands, and these two different cultures have almost developed in separation from one another.
Yeah,
obviously,
absolutely.
it's a continent in the case of the United States, but
But it's a very strange example in the sense that we share a common language, and many times in history, even with Greece and Rome, who partially shared a language, they did not have anywhere near the same amount of cultural similarity to facilitate cultural transfer that we do today. So I think that makes it also a very interesting case to discuss.
I know, and although the United States has been around for quite a long time now, that it's kind of impressive really how much similarities there still are in a way. Sure, there are differences, but
Separated by a common language is the classic joke, isn't it? America and Britain.
yes. So first and foremost, the question I wanted to address is why is it America in particular that we're looking at? And I think this is probably in part to do with the common language. However, the United States is also the dominant force in the world at the minute.
It is, and we were going to title this American Cultural Imperialism, and we were very close to doing so, but it does seem to be a very strong fact throughout history that the dominant force in the world has the most ability to spread its culture, to propagate its culture and ideas and TV shows and blue jeans and so on. So,
because of course, there's got to be some aspect of that culture that has led to its success, right?
Yeah, and that's certainly what people think. People like to think that anyway. And it is interesting how even when you're just talking about culture, there is this curious interplay between cultural propagation and power, which is something, of course, that the left absolutely loves to get all over because they think everything is about power, but still.
Of course, the United States, although it does not formally own lands outside of its actual borders, it has an enormous amount of influence over what goes on in other countries through a whole host of different means, through international organisations, through diplomacy.
Dollar diplomacy. So they have a huge amount of influence in international finance, which every single country absolutely depends on for its survival. So that is the main axis, or one of the main axes through which they can propagate their influence. They also have the world's most powerful military, and probably the most powerful military relative to other militaries in the history of humankind. And if you look at maps of American military bases, for example, you can see that, okay, American soldiers are everywhere. And so that's another vector of cultural transmission. If you have a large garrison, obviously, you're going to have Americans there wanting to do American things, eat American foods, speak American, talk. And in places like South Korea, where there are large garrisons, that's another vector of cultural transfer.
Sure. And if you actually look at a map of all of the American bases, they're never more than a few hours away from any country that might be giving them trouble, I suppose.
It's definitely... you could call it an empire if you wanted to, I think.
I think it's a strong word that has specific connotations, but I think it's almost like an empire for a different time.
Yes, it's not the empire you think of when you're talking about the age of empires. And
it's not like the Roman Empire where they control an entire
Yeah, where it's complete hegemony over various territories. It's not that, but it's a more sort of loose 21st century version of cultural and influential propagation.
There is, of course, lots of things that are unique about this compared to past hegemonic forces, and that's, you could, as we alluded to earlier, compare America's position with the Greeks and the Romans.
And our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has, I believe, explicitly said this before, that Britain should be a progenitor Greece to America's Rome.
Yes.
He likes his classical allusions.
And basically what he's trying to get at there, the Prime Minister, is that he's trying to say, as with the Greeks to the Romans, the Greeks basically were the ones who tried to encourage them to look into certain amounts of high culture. So a lot of Roman arts, literature, the sort of sculptures, all of this was influenced through Greek culture, because I think the Greeks simply got there first, didn't they?
Yes. So, and even in Roman society, in Roman high society, for a long period of time, I believe that people used Greek for rhetoric and for some legal cases, perhaps, and for theatre and drama as well. So they definitely had an outsized influence, but this was rather inaccessible to the common Roman, of course, the plebs.
And of course, in the Eastern Roman Empire, the language of administration was Greek.
Yes, of course. Although I'm thinking of a much earlier phase in the Roman Empire. But yes, most of technically, if you take the Byzantine Empire as the Roman Empire, then most of the Roman Empire was Greek for most of its history, which is strange because it's not really a Roman Empire then, is it?
Well, there's a case to be made there, isn't there?
We should get Bo on that. I'm sure he'll have plenty of illuminating information.
I mean, it was certainly Roman in and of itself, but nevertheless, there is that sort of influence of there being a parent culture kind of pushing stuff downstream and it kind of being changed by the Romans. The Romans, of course, did most of the work in disseminating it beyond Greece in many ways. They recognised the value in it and continued to spread it. Of course, in the past, though, the scope of the cultural transmission was limited by lots of different factors. So the relatively sedentary lifestyle of the citizens, time it takes for information to travel, the cost of travel, literacy rates, the ability to learn foreign languages, and the general lack of interest in outside cultures, which is fair enough when...
Not compared to now.
Yes, that's what I mean. And then in the modern day, of course, we've got the ability to fly anywhere in the world within 24 hours.
If you've got your vaccinations up to date, of course.
Yes,
and if you have your passport, and if you have this, and if you have that, and if you have the money to do so, then yes, you absolutely can do that.
And there is, of course, instant information exchange on the internet, which I imagine you're probably watching this on now. Satellites and things such as that. We've got disposable income. Well, some of us do. And more spare time to dedicate to whatever we want. We generally are literate and have easy access to means of understanding foreign languages. And therefore, it allows culture to disseminate far more quickly than it would have in the past. And this is something that's very new and actually doesn't really get talked about very much, in that we talk about advancements in terms of technology and perhaps even political advancements. But we don't tend to talk about culture changing and advancing and how certain technologies have facilitated culture changing more quickly.
That's probably because most of the recent cultural changes have been backwards.
It's a tool order to...
Well, the reason I say that is that, I mean, obviously we talk about ourselves being in the middle of a culture war. Countries like France and Japan, they see the culture coming out of the West and they see all of the... LGBTQIA++ stuff as American culture, as English culture. Now, I would draw a distinction. I don't think that is American culture. I think that's this sort of alien organism that's grown out of the American cultural environment from the universities and various small places. But it's fundamentally an ideology and not a culture.
Yes.
And I feel like the impact of this ideology on society has been that culture has more or less gone backwards, Ned, over the last 20 years.
That sort of ideology or that part of the culture is at odds with traditional American culture. Like it's certainly not friendly to the American Constitution and
the American borders, not friendly to those
and
either. Meritocracy, not friendly to that. The list goes on. And
generally speaking, America tends to be kind of a liberty-loving nation, whereas with this sort of new sect of people, is very much against that cultural tradition.
I've heard it described as a sort of infiltration of continental philosophy into the fundamentally sort of Anglo philosophy of traditional American culture. And there definitely seems to be a deep and fundamental philosophical clash of values between the two ideologies.
Well, I mean, America's sort of founding values and the founding culture of the country is very admirable. And I'm going to go on and talk about some aspects of American culture I'm not necessarily fond of. But to be honest, in terms of your political traditions, you've still got it far more in order than we do.
Well, it's amazing. If anything, America has the sin of being too successful as a political system, that they become complacent in thinking that their system will work elsewhere. But the fact that their constitution has largely stood the test of time for 250 years is very impressive as an achievement.
Especially considering it's just something that was created. Obviously, they carried over knowledge from previous.
Yeah, they had a legal inheritance.
Yes, exactly. And they were also clearly very intelligent people. However, usually with times changing, you would expect there to be less of a fit, but to be honest,
if you look at other examples from history, so you've got Simón Bolívar, El Libertador in Latin America, and he tried to build this great state of Gran Colombia, and it just completely fell apart, I think even before his death. And that's what usually happens, quite frankly, something like that. And that didn't happen with America, which is remarkable.
So yes, there's a large amount of credit due here, so please don't feel like
we're America bashing when we get onto the things we don't like later on.
Yes. In fact, I would go so far as to say that if I could live anywhere other than Britain, it probably would be the United States. No?
Okay, there are some parts of the United States I would love to go to and possibly even live, but I think the political situation at the moment is a little...
I feel like if you go out into a bit more sort of rural areas, everyone's probably really nice to one another.
Great things about Montana and Wyoming.
I feel like New Hampshire, there's no tax rate, as in income tax rate there. Pretty low taxes, a functioning libertarian party. That's something. But no, I feel like we've given America its due now.
We have.
So we can move on to some other stuff.
Yeah, you should be properly lubricated for what's coming next.
So why does America actually occupy this dominant position? And I think we're probably going to...
Well, they were Johnny come lately to 2 world wars. As the classic line goes.
Yes.
I think smart geopolitics, in other words. They turned up late to 2 titanic conflicts, which took out all of the other competing world powers, and they just stood alone at the end of it.
So yes, they allowed the European powers, who were comparable at the time at least, to destroy each other, and then came along to sweep up the pieces, and then also invested a huge amount of money into Europe to help rebuild the country, thus further leveraging their power over.
Yes, and they used this. You shouldn't think that this is purely a charitable exercise, because, for example, in the Suez Crisis in 1956, the Americans literally said, well, okay, we'll withdraw all of your aid unless you do what we say. And that was effective in stopping a war, simply that threat. So simply by putting that money into Europe, that was another way of leveraging huge geopolitical influence over the continent.
And it was a significant factor in the breakup of the European colonial empires as well.
Yes, which was an American foreign policy priority from as early as the 1920s and 30s.
So yes, a lot of the British Empire was destroyed by the United States.
Yes, and
I'm sorry to say.
And I'm not particularly resentful about that. I think it's very obvious why they would want to do that.
Yes.
Certainly from their perspective, from a geopolitical perspective, it's just good business practice. But it's a fact of life, and I think that it's silly not to recognise that that America did play a central role in the dismantlement of the British Empire.
I think it's the founding force, really. They did far more than Germany did in World War II to dismantle the British Empire. But there we go. So yes, it was this sort of World War II, post-World War II sort of environment where American culture started to bleed over to Britain. Sure, beforehand we had little tidbits of American culture.
Perhaps the first really big wave was the American GIs and servicemen in Britain during the war.
Yeah, I can certainly see that. I mean, there was a very large number of people. It would makes sense that it would be some sort of cultural exchange.
Well, I remember there was a lot of resentment from national servicemen in Britain at the time towards American GIs because they basically came over flush with material wealth, whether it's cigarettes, chewing gum, silk stockings, you name it. They basically filled their boots before they came over, and they had loads of wealth to trade, whereas Britain was in very severe wartime rationing. And this obviously had a very powerful effect on the perception of Americans in Britain. One thing I've heard, especially for the sort of senior generation, older 60s and 70s, they have a perception of Americans as being uniformly like 6 feet, 6.5 feet tall, really strong, muscular, like they've just walked out of a Western. Now, if you see modern Americans, generally most of them don't meet that description, but that's the cultural representation, the image that people form of Americans from that era because of the GIs and so on coming over.
It's almost like they sent their best soldiers in a way, and that was like a propaganda mission, obviously not deliberately.
Well, also, I think Hollywood played a part in that perception, but it's an important thing to recognise.
No, that seems perfectly reasonable. But sort of post-World War II, you see a little bit more interest in American culture. And I read someone talking at the time, talking about how the jukebox was a relic of American culture.
Really?
And this is, although we basically designed our own, it was seen as a distinctly American thing. And it's very difficult to really pick up on that because it's kind of that sort of anecdotal experience is something that gets lost to time throughout history most of the time. But I was fortunate enough to read lots of sources talking about this sort of thing. And they basically pinned it down to two things. So there was a large generational gap from World War II and, of course, significant economic effects. So there was a lot of incentive to look elsewhere because if you're inheriting a situation where it's pretty dire, I mean, it's post-World War II, you're still under rationing, all this sort of thing. Yes, you've got all of this. People probably are motivated to seek new ways of life. And one of the ways they did this is through the jukebox and American music and things like that. And this is one of the more early ways of things propagating, which I think is why by the time it gets to the 1960s, you've got all of these British bands playing basically American rock and roll, and then going back to the United States.
For example, like the Beatles, Yeah, 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 that would be seen as incredibly vulgar and American at the time. It should be yes, 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 surely in Britain. But
that sounds silly, though.
I remember there being an interview with one of the Beatles, it might even have been Paul, saying how you can't sing yes, yes, yes. It doesn't work. You have to sing yeah, yeah, yeah. You have to Americanize a lot of these words to actually work in the context of the music, to have that sing-song quality. It's quite funny, I thought.
No, I think he has a point in there, to be honest. And it does work. And I think that in many ways, although we have inherited some aspects of American culture, particularly in the music in that sort of era from, say, the 40s, the 50s, you've got your Elvis Presleys and people like that, and lots of blues music that I think bled over to Britain, and then we kind of made it our own a little bit and then exported it back, and that was known as the British invasion, where you had bands like the Beatles, the Stones, Led Zeppelin, all those sorts of bands.
And that was incredible. I mean, compare that before or since. I think the British music, pop music, popular music, not classical or opera or musical, from the 20s and 30s and so on, and the 40s, is, to my ears, very boring. It has an aesthetic. That aesthetic is nice if you want that aesthetic. If you want to go to sort of a Blitz-themed cafe and listen to some 40s tunes, then go for it. That's great. But it's fundamentally boring if that's the only thing you've got. And then as soon as you've got the American rock and roll influence and the anglicization of that by the Beatles, by Led Zeppelin and so on, the Rolling Stones, that's just amazing. It's a whole new era in musical experience. And I'm really grateful for that. It's one of the best cultural influences we've had from America, I think.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.